Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. Mike Rowe is, of course, you know Mike Rowe. He's the host of How America Works on Fox Business. He's also the founder of Mike Rowe Works Foundation. For many years, one of the most famous people on television with a hit show called Dirty Jobs, which, by the way, canceled for reasons that were never clear. It's coming back to Discovery, a new season next year, which is great news for all the many fans, including me, of that show. We are grateful to have Mike Rowe in our studio right now. Mike Rowe.
Pretty good news for me, too, Tucker.
It's pretty great. So before we get to that, I was thinking in the shower this morning, you're one of those people who's been famous for so long that people feel like, oh, I know a lot about Mike Rowe, but really, I'm not sure that I do, and I'm like a mega fan. So just give us like the 5-minute how you got to where you are now. Like, where are you from? How'd you get here?
I'm going to need 1 minute to get past the whole notion of you thinking of me in the shower.
Well, I literally was thinking in the shower. I'm like, what do we know about Mike Rowe?
Let's just pretend that happened. I grew up on a little farm in Baltimore County next to a man named Carl Noble, who was my grandfather and only went to the 7th grade and started working when he was young, became a master electrician by the time he was 30, and then went on to become one of those geniuses who could take your watch apart, blindfolded, put it back together, fix anything, build anything.
Oh, I love people like that.
And so he was a magician, and I kind of grew up in his shadow with my mom and dad, my younger brothers, and there they were.
And you live next door.
We lived right next door on a little hilltop. It was a great piece of property because the state couldn't develop the woods behind us on account of the power lines that ran through it. And we had a stream on the other side and lowlands that made the whole area undevelopable. So we had, like 80 acres. We didn't own it, but nobody could get to it.
How far from Baltimore City?
This is the crazy thing. Maybe 3 miles, if. So for the first 12 years of my life, I thought I was Mark Twain or like Huck Finn, like in the middle of nowhere. In reality, we were actually very close to the city. But we just never really saw it. It was a very simple childhood. My dad and my grandfather woke up clean every morning and came home dirty after fixing something, putting in a root cellar or, laying pipe here or building a stable there. We had horses. My mom was a big rider. And so I had a privileged, albeit very modest, childhood. I didn't know it was modest.
And so all the drama in Baltimore, which is this great manufacturing center for many, many years, Steel Town, kind of declined at exactly the moment that you were growing up there.
Well, yeah, there was some crossover. My dad, he moonlighted at Bethlehem Steel. He also was over at the Broning GM plant for a while, like a lot of men were in those days. But Baltimore was a big, small town. And it was a great place for me to grow up next to and eventually moved to. But look, the short version is, regarding Dirty Jobs and my granddad, the Dirty Jobs, I was 42 when I pitched that idea, and it was a tribute to him, because the handy gene, as you may have noticed, is recessive, right? And as certain as I was that I would follow in his footsteps, I just didn't get the skills. So I got into entertainment and started impersonating a host, which I did for probably 20 years. I sang in the Baltimore Opera for 8 years.
Oh, wait, so did you go to school, or what? How did you get...
So what happened to me was, when I got out of high school, I'd taken some tests and did pretty well, and got a lot of pressure from my guidance counselor to look into University of Pennsylvania, James Madison. Had no money, and had no idea what I wanted to do, right? So that was my first run-in with expectations vis-a-vis education.
Yes.
My parents, who both taught public school, were very cool about the whole thing. They said, look, it's important to be curious and it's important to study, but borrowing money, let's maybe not do that. And so
Even when it was pretty cheap, relatively speaking.
It was pretty cheap, but the only 4-letter word in my house growing up that was really verboten was debt. And so the idea of borrowing money to get an education, it just seemed anathema, So I went to a community college for 2.5 years. And I studied everything. At $18 a credit, you can afford to be wrong.
Yeah, yes.
Right? And so I dabbled with philosophy and English. It was my grandpa who told me a few years earlier, when I completely failed at the whole trades thing, he's like, look, you can be a tradesman, Mike. Just get a different toolbox. So community college was the beginning of that. I took acting classes, I took writing classes, I took singing classes.
Were they pretty good?
I thought they were great. They were challenging for me because this career that I'm in now was not the vocation that I ever thought I would pursue. I had no real passion for it. In
Well,
fact,
you're the only one in the vocation, so yeah.
well, I had a stammer when I was a kid, and I was really shy, and I just didn't like the whole notion of being around cameras and things was just.
You had a stammer?
Yeah.
Well, you're famous for your voice, so that's a little
weird. Well, it wasn't like a full-on Porky Pig, I'll be able to be that, but it could get bad, and it was bad enough to keep me quiet. And I got very lucky. There've been some men in my life, my dad, my granddad, and a high school teacher named Fred King, who's a music teacher, who taught me that, of course, you can't stutter when you sing.
Yes.
And then he made me audition for a play once. And going on stage and fumbling through a monologue, knowing that I was going to stammer all over myself, I did it because he asked me to. I trusted him that much. And I remember I got about 20 seconds into it, and I'm tripping, and the words are sticking in my throat. And Fred King says, Mikey, I really like what you're doing with the part, but the character doesn't stutter. So why don't you do that on your own time? Try it once without all the, right? I mean, it was so glib, right? I mean, and believe me, I'm not saying this would work for people with a stutter if it's a physiological problem.
Right.
But mine wasn't. Mine was in my head. And so I immediately went back to the beginning, and I did it without a stammer.
As a character who doesn't stutter.
And about 20 seconds into it, I look out, and Fred's sitting in the audience with, a few other people, and he goes, and that was like a moment where I thought, you know what? I'm going to act like somebody who doesn't stutter for a while and see where that goes. And
that is deep. Actually.
Well, it was simple, and teachers nowadays, I wish they had permission to do that kind of thing more, right?
Yeah.
To challenge kids more. Fred King was not a politically correct teacher. He was a lover of the arts, but he was also a retired Golden Glove boxer, an all-state football player, Navy man. He was a tough guy who would cry when he recited poetry and weep when he sang these old sentimental songs.
Oh.
He was literally known as the king of the barbershoppers. He ran, basically, he was a legend in the Barbershop Harmony Society.
Yes.
And he brought me into this world of four-part harmony. The Chorus of the Chesapeake, not far from Bethlehem Steel, met every Tuesday night. And Tucker, I didn't realize it at the time because you normally don't realize the big moments in your life that are shaping you, but this was a group of maybe 120 men, most of whom were veterans. Many had fought in the Korean War, some in Vietnam, and a lot in the Second World War. This is 1979. And every Tuesday night, I'd go down there to the city hospital where they rehearsed, and then we'd go to Johnny Jones, this little hole in the wall in Highlandtown. And I sat there, watching these men break off in groups of four, and they'd blow a pitch pipe, and they'd start singing these old songs from another century I'd never heard of. And they taught me these songs, and these were songs of sweethearts and friends who would never let you down, and war, and love of country and patriotism. And these men, they'd cry as they sang, and then they'd bring me in and they'd teach me a part. And I'm probably talking to you today because at that time in my life, just the right forces, just the right circumstances conspired to show me what art looked like and work.
Yes.
And through the eyes of men, like hardened, tempered men who would nevertheless cry like a baby in the midst of some old Tin Pan Alley song.
Because they could afford to, because there's no question about.
Because there was no shame.
Right.
And those songs spoke the truth, Those are, I mean, I'm not going to whine about the music today, but the music of the last century was different because there was it channeled real feelings like grief.
Yes.
And pain and
the
suffering
complexity
and betrayal.
of life. Yeah.
And I mean, getting a look at that songbook at such an early age was important to me in ways that honestly I didn't realize until Dirty Jobs started. many, many years later, because that show brought me back face to face with a lot of those types of men. And it was very personal for me, that show. It was, like I said, a tribute to my pop.
So what did you do? So the 20 years between getting out of community college and pitching dirty jobs, what did you do?
Well, out of community college, I went to work for a bit. I auditioned and got into the Baltimore Opera because, not because I wanted to sing, but because I could, and because I needed my union card to work in the Screen Actors Guild. But you can't get your Screen Actors Guild unless you audition for shows that are run by the Screen Actors Guild. And you can't get an agent unless you have your card, and you can't get a card unless you have your agent, and so forth. However, if you can get into the American Guild of Musical Artists, the union that oversees the opera, then you can buy your Screen Actors Guild card. So my business plan out of community college.
And get the health insurance, which is good.
You bet.
Yeah.
And the girls.
Yeah.
Right? So this is 80 people in a rep company, and we all are on stage with the best singers in the world. Pavarotti came through, Domingo came through, and suddenly I'm singing some of the greatest pieces ever composed. And it was great. I was 22 years old, dressed as a pirate, singing at the top of my lungs. How I got in, they gave me a break. I learned the shortest aria I could find. I sang it as loud as I could during an open call.
In Italian.
In Italian, yeah. It was from La Boheme, the Coat aria. And I sang it for a guy named Bill Iannuzzi, who was the musical director there at the time. Vecchia zemara senti, resto pianto scende, resacriamento devi, right, on and on I go. And I get done and he says, you have no idea what you're saying, do you? And I said, no, sir, I don't. So he explained what the aria meant, and then he had me sing it in another key, and then another key after that. And he said, yeah, we need young guys with low voices. You're in. And so I got in. I got my card. And then I bought my SAG card, and then I figured I'd be done with it, but the music turned out to be better than I thought. And I made some great friends, and I had another look at a world I didn't really know existed. Barbershop and grand opera, one after the next. Then I went to a university for a couple years, Towson.
Yeah.
And got my credentials because I figured it couldn't hurt, and I was still curious to learn stuff. And then I went to work in this industry as a communicator because I got my communications degree. Now, I checked the want ads. People weren't hiring communicators, but my degree helped me. Well, my education helped me.
Yes.
I don't know that my degree did or didn't, but I do know that later my experience in that community college and in that university led to the foundation that I run today, which actually has nothing to do with college at all.
No.
And everything to do with training.
Just the opposite.
Well,
But what did you do? What was your first gig out of Towson?
Oh, well, there were a lot of non-showbiz gigs. Selling magazines over the phone, selling water purifiers out of the back of my trunk. I had a lot of sales jobs because I could create the illusion of credibility and competence in short bursts, which, as you know, comes in.
Yes, it does.
Comes in handy.
That's a critical skill for television.
No, the opera was my first actual paid gig in entertainment. And then after that, it was just a cavalcade of freelance, right? It was, QVC was the biggie. I was sitting one evening in the Mount Royal Tavern during the intermission of something called the Ring des Nibelungen, dressed as a Viking. I went over to watch the football game and drink a beer, which I recommend if you're going to be singing German. And the football game wasn't on. There was a big guy in a shiny suit selling pots and pans, and the bartender was auditioning the next day for that guy's job. QVC was doing a national talent search. And I sat there, and I thought it might be the end of Western civilization, a 24-hour commercial. But I also thought, I think I can do that.
Oh, for sure.
I think I can do that, So, yeah, the next day I went with the bartender to audition, and I got high. I talked about a pencil for 8 minutes, which was the audition in those days.
That is a rare skill.
I don't know that it's a skill. It's a proclivity. and I had it. Look, it's actually really interesting. There was no playbook in 1990 for what would make a successful home shopping host.
Right.
Actors couldn't really sell. Salesmen sometimes seized up in front of the camera.
Yes.
So how do you determine if you're talking to somebody who can actually do that job?
Well, you hire an opera singer, obviously.
Look, the first thing you say is, we can't. We just don't know. And to their credit, they did. But they needed some sort of protocol. So they rolled a pencil across the table, and they turned on the camera, turned on the red light, and said, when I say action, Mike, pick up the pencil, make me want it. Don't stop talking until I tell you to stop.
Make me want
Make me want the pencil. And so they don't tell you when you start, but if you can do that for 8 minutes straight, you're hired.
I'd hire you in a second. Anyone who could do that for 8 minutes is an amazing person.
Well, look, either that or they've got a tremendous amount of time on their hands, and they took a lot of courses that didn't really benefit them directly, but did obliquely help them do virtually.
What did you say about the pencil for 8 minutes?
Well, the first thing you do is you get into the obvious feature benefit, right? It's yellow. That's the feature. But what's the benefit? Well, you're a busy person, and when you open your cluttered desk drawer looking for the pencil, that bright canary yellow pops out. So you don't waste valuable time rummaging around for the instrument, right? You talk about the eraser, but not just the fact that it's there. You talk about the fact that it's there in the exact proportion needed to last the life of the pencil based on careful studies that will indicate the amount of erasing the average pencil will require during the course of its life. As you sharpen it, it gets smaller. So this pencil is made with everything you need and nothing you don't, right? And then, of course, you talk about the little silver thing that attaches the eraser to the pencil. Now, in my case, I said it's actual silver, which is rare. That's why the pencil's $20. But the money that we raise from this pencil will come back to help the kids in Madagascar. Why? Because Madagascar graphite is what's inside, not lead. And that's important because if you lick the tip of lead, well, you'll go crazy with the poisoning from the lead. But the Madagascar graphite, right? So I'm just making crap up. I just go on and on and on. And then, then I'm 2 minutes in. So you start talking about yourself. The first love letter I wrote to Heather Cleby, I wrote in a pencil. The first crossword puzzle I ever did, and the last one I do in pencil, because you need to be able to correct your mistakes. Every great theorem from Einstein was written in a pencil. The list goes on. So you start talking about the impact of a pencil, not just on Western civilization, but on the individual who wields it, and you craft it as a tool. And when you put it in the hands of a tradesman, well, what comes out the other end? If you're Picasso, priceless sketches. Now, the question is, the pencil goes to you, and what will you do with it? And so, anyway, he hired me. And literally Tucker...
They must have never seen anything like that in their lives.
Well, I'll tell you what they didn't see anything like. They didn't see anything like 3 nights later at 3 a.m. when I started the training program, because there was no training program at QVC. What happens is if you get through the pencil thing, they put you on the air. It's live, right? And
where was it?
Westchester, Pennsylvania.
In like some sort of giant factory studio type thing?
Huge studio. Giant, round, rotating set. And so while you're out doing one thing on this set, they're dressing the set behind you. And when the hour's done, the whole stage rotates. And then you go in for an hour of ideas to make your life easier, ideas for your home, fashions for her, electronics for him, 18-karat gold. I mean, there were 3,900 products in the QVC inventory in those days. Most of them looked like they had been purloined from the arcade of a condemned Midway at some carnival. I mean, with respect, I'd never seen the Health Team infrared pain reliever, the Amcor negative ion generator. So you literally sit there, and they bring you this endless stream of mystical devices, and you have to talk about them for 8 minutes at a shot. But, of course, if you can do that with a pencil, the thinking is you'll probably be okay with an 18-karat gold Byzantine bracelet or whatever it is. And so that's what it was. 3 hours a night, baptism by fire.
Live.
That's
a lot of, just for the viewers who haven't been on TV for 3 hours at a shot, that's a lot of TV.
Well, you're doing it today, right? I mean...
Yeah, but first of all, it's on tape and whatever. But 3 hour, I did a weekend show for a few years. It was multiple hours. I mean, that is not a joke.
No, it's not. But I'll tell you what it does. It forces you not just to figure out the mechanics of your job. It forces you to understand who you're talking to. Like, you tell me if this is the case for you. When you're doing your show, do you have in your mind an idea of who you're talking to?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, Stephen King used to write about this in terms of, he called him constant reader, right? So his books were always written with an amalgam of his fans in mind. And that's what QVC did for me. It forced me to imagine who I was talking to.
Yes.
Right? And it trained me. I mean, I make a lot of fun of it these days, but the truth is, there was no better training program.
No, I can't imagine there
in the
could
world.
be better. For television, 3 hours
Nothing like
live
it.
every day talking with no script?
No script and no delay. No 7-second delay. So I'll tell you some stories off air that you will. Unbelievable stories. Because if you can get on the air and the camera is locked down, like it's on me right now, you're just there. And the technical director just walks away from the camera. It's 2 a.m. He's getting a cup of coffee, and you get somebody on the air who decides they're going to say the most deeply inappropriate thing you've ever heard about you, okay? And, I mean, the obscenity is breathtaking, and there's nothing you can do except sit there and blink at the camera, right, and watch everybody around you kind of collapse. It's, you know, that kind of thing doesn't happen much today because, you know, you've got delays and you got
Everything's
all sorts of stuff.
controlled, yeah.
There's nothing controlled. These guys had a tiger by the tail.
And
today,
it was successful. QVC actually worked.
They did $9 billion last year.
That's insane. How long were you there?
Forever. No, I was fired 3 times over the course of 3 years, and hired back each time. In part, I didn't take the job super seriously.
Yeah.
But in my defense, I was told from the get-go that my job wasn't to sell the product. My job was to get the people watching. The products would sell themselves. And the programmers would arrange them in a way that would make the transaction positively irresistible to the viewer. My job was just to be sort of charming, right, and keep the wheels on the bus. But at 3 a.m, when you're trying to figure out who you're talking to and who you are and how you wound up here, the temptation to make fun of the eel skin wallet from the Lee Sands selection is virtually irresistible.
I can't even imagine.
And so I lapsed into a kind of, my job, as I redefined it, was to gently make fun of the products and politely ridicule the viewer. And so this happened for 3 hours a night for 3 years. And I was able to turn that weird little chunk of real estate into a kind of variety show, starring products I didn't understand and viewers that honestly were a lot of codependent inebriates.
Right?
You know.
Totally, or nursing mothers, or
Whatever's going on,
Yeah,
right?
who's watching at that hour?
But I wound up loving them. I wound up falling in love with that collective amalgam of people. And looking back, what that job really did for me was it made me a really good auditioner.
Yeah.
And so when I finally did embark on my actual career when I was 30, I got out of QVC when I was 30, and that's when I finally got my toolbox together. Everything my grandfather had told me to do 10 years earlier, I could talk at length about nothing at all. I could write, I could sing, I could do some stuff.
Yeah.
And so I went to Hollywood and New York with the mindset of a tradesman.
Yes.
I was not swinging for the fences. I was not looking for home runs. I didn't want a hit show. Last thing I wanted was a hit show. My career early on was based on Travis McGee,
Yeah.
right, from John D. McDonald,
Totally.
the famous salvage expert who took his retirement in early installments and just came out of it every now and then to do a job. And that's how I looked at it. And I hit a couple stand-up doubles, but mostly singles, for 12 years.
What did you do?
I worked for American Airlines, producing a lot of their in-flight entertainment. I worked for PBS, doing a show called New York Expeditions. I worked for Dick Clark, hosting a game show called No Relation. I worked for the Medical Broadcasting Company, hosting a show for Prevention Magazine called Body Sense, dozens of shows. I touched everything like it was hot. I got paid for my trouble, not a lot, but fairly. And then I took some time off, and I came back and I did it again. I narrated everything. If there was a wildebeest trying to get across the vast reaches of the barren Serengeti, but being tragically slowly consumed by hyenas and jackals, I was telling you about it. And note to self, never works out for the wildebeest.
No, it never does. You don't want to be the slowest animal in the savannah.
Don't leave the herd. Never works out.
Oh, it's so deep. So your voice, your work ethic, your sense of humor, kind of, you all these things come together, and it turns out those are like central skills.
Well, look, in this industry, they don't hurt you.
No.
And if you know it when you don't, you know it when you're missing any of those things.
Yes.
Right? You know it. You've seen it. You've seen relatively successful people who are very good at what they're doing, but they're not in on the joke.
No. Oh.
Right? They're just not in on the joke. They
Boy.
don't. They can't. They can't find the humor.
I know.
And or the self-awareness or
yes,
whatever
that's right.
it is. And look, I was that guy. I mean, I became facile at impersonating a host to the point where I became arrogant in the way you do when you think you've figured something out that a lot of your contemporaries haven't.
Yes.
So I was very comfortable. And I was hosting Evening Magazine in San Francisco. This is one of those half-hour shows that comes on after the news.
Yes.
Right? It's a little piece of fluff, and I would go around the Bay Area, talking about wineries and, restaurant openings and throwing to prepackaged stories on this little show. And one day, this is CBS, I'm in my cubicle, and my mother calls me. And she says, Michael, your grandfather's 90 years old. And I said, yeah. And she said, he's not going to live forever. Would it be great if before he died, he could turn the TV on and see you doing something that looks like work?
I like your mom.
I mean, devastating, right? Like, Jesus, Mom, it's brutal. So the next day, my cameraman and I and a producer went into the sewers of San Francisco to host an episode of Evening Magazine, because Evening could be hosted anywhere. And I figured, well, you know what? My pop will get a kick out of seeing me host a show from a sewer, because he'd been in a few, and why not? Well, what happened that day in that sewer...
The sewers are old in San Francisco.
They're old everywhere, but they're ancient in San Francisco. So I did what I always do, right? I sat up the night before. I read up on the sewers. I learned that there were 3.7 million bricks hauled in 1907 and so forth and so on. And I learned about laterals, and I learned about the unique fact that the sewers in San Francisco followed the topography of the streets above. And so they were very hilly and treacherous. And I got all this stuff jammed in my head, and I'm going to share it with the viewer, as a good host would do. But what actually happened formed the basis of a book I wrote a couple years ago, because in the sewer, I realized I was not in charge at all. I was basically baptized in a river of crap. The rats wouldn't let me do the job. Exploding laterals defaced me. Roaches the size of your thumb. It was impossible to work. Oh. So what I wound up doing was helping the sewer inspector replace bricks. That was his job, and he was just down there as a prop for me, really. He was just some guy in the background doing work while I was hosting my show.
Yeah.
And when it became obvious that I wasn't going to be able to host the show in a traditional way, I just started working with the inspector. And the cameraman followed everything. And what wound up going on the air a couple nights later was a segment with Mike in the sewer, with a sewer inspector, replacing rotten bricks. And in the conversation, the completely unscripted conversation I had with the sewer inspector, we learned everything that I had put in my head the night before. We just didn't learn it from me. We learned it from him.
Yeah.
Because he's the expert. This anonymous guy laboring out of sight and out of mind suddenly became the featured player in a conversation / interview with this guy who had been impersonating a host, this former opera singing, barbershop singing, QVC selling guy who suddenly, at 42, is having the first truly authentic moment on TV that I'd ever had. And that footage, Some people were enraged, right? I mean, it's 7:30 at night. It's the Bay Area. People are sitting down in Marin to enjoy their meatloaf or
For sure.
maybe a heartwarming story of a three-legged dog overcoming canine kidney failure or something.
Yes.
And they get me crawling through a river of crap, right? I mean, unspeakably filthy conditions, sweating and working. It was not the segment for Evening Magazine. But I got hundreds of letters from people who loved it, not because they enjoyed me necessarily, but people who said, man, if that's what you're going to do, you should meet my brother, my uncle, my cousin, my sister, my mom, my dad, my aunt. Wait till you see what they do. And in that moment, I knew that what we had just done was not being done on TV, and that there was a massive underserved audience, and that there was maybe a chance to take reality TV and let it live up to its name. Right? Remember, this is 2002. Survivor, and I think Jesse James is building motorcycles in his garage. That's it. So the idea of going out into the world as an apprentice and not an expert, or as a guest instead of a host, right? That was new. And that was what I tried to sell.
That was only 2002, so Dirty Jobs became huge immediately.
Well, it premiered to great numbers.
When did it premiere?
In late 2003, it went on the air, and it rated through the roof. Problem was, it wasn't the show that, at the time, the Discovery Channel wanted its viewers to love.
Right. Not consistent with their idea of the brand.
Correct. And so it got shelved for nearly a year. And while it was on the shelf...
So you just had the premiere and that was it?
We did 3 episodes for my pop, and that was okay with me, honestly. Like I said, I wasn't swinging for a hit. I just wanted to get something on the air that looked good and was fun. I wanted to celebrate work, honestly. I didn't want to portray it as drudgery, and I didn't want to portray it as, look for the union label. I didn't want to do any of the tropes,
no, just like, what's it actually like?
That's it. Fly on the wall, do the work, show the day through the eyes of an apprentice.
Yes.
Right? And so we did it, and I thought it was great, but it created a fair amount of cognitive dissonance, elsewhere. And so during that time, the network said, well, look, let's go on adventures. That's what you wanted to do anyway. And I said, yeah. So I went to Egypt for a while to work with the Antiquities Bureau there, crawling through tombs, tomb raiding, basically. I was going to go to the Titanic with James Cameron, but this thing came up in Alaska called Deadliest Catch, and they wanted me to go up there and host that show. It wasn't called Deadliest Catch at the time. That show now is in its 18th season.
That's incredible.
Crab Fisherman, right? I think it's one of the greatest shows in the history of reality TV, simply because you can't script the Bering Sea.
No.
You can't screw it up. So I went up there, and that was remarkable. That was 2004, and while I was up there, 6 men died. So 6 weeks up there, I went to 6 funerals. Wow. And I didn't know what I was doing, right? And they weren't sure what I should do. Are you a host? Are you a greenhorn? Is this a documentary? We didn't know. We just knew that there was a world of work up there, unlike anything we had seen before. And when we came back with the footage, the network looked at it, and that's when they were like, well, you know what? We're going to go with this, but it doesn't need a host. It might need a host. We're not sure. But that Dirty Jobs thing could be interesting, too. What do you think? And I had to choose. You can't host 2 shows, the same network at the same time, unless you're Tucker Carlson, of course. Today and tonight.
And tomorrow.
I'm waiting for Tucker Carlson tomorrow. Tucker Carlson.
So are many people.
So next week. No, but look, in the end, when in doubt, pick the show with your name in the title.
Yes.
So Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe went on the air in earnest in 2005. Deadliest Catch, I stayed on to narrate. And I did both those. I'm still narrating.
You've been voicing that show for 18 years.
Yeah, every episode. And I love it because I like days that aren't identical to the one before it.
Yeah.
Or after it. And so if you do a fair amount of voiceover and a fair amount of immersed television and a fair amount of writing and a little bit of acting and some writing, then you can have a
A full and balanced life.
Well, I wouldn't say balanced, but full, for sure.
So how long was so Dirty Jobs? I can't believe it was only 2005 because it really got big fast.
It did.
So you went from being, I think what they used to call in the UK, a jobber. Mm-hmm. You know, a man with skills going from job site to job site, doing his gig.
Yeah.
Thinking I don't really want to be tied to like one big show to actually being tied to one big show.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, it was great in the sense that, you know, I've got a lot of friends in the business who got sort of famous for playing a character.
Yeah.
And when that happens, you have to be that character
100%.
all the time.
Yes.
This was me, for better or worse, right? There was no pretense. It was a very honest show, and I never pretended to do anything on Dirty Jobs that I couldn't do in real life. Right? We never did a second take on Dirty Jobs. No rehearsal, no pre-production, no script, no take two. You know, it was a blisteringly honest show. In fact, it was the second season when things really changed. And I said, listen, production is the enemy of authenticity.
That's for sure.
Always.
Yes.
Right? But you have to have production, otherwise you have no show.
Right.
So you and I are caught in an eternal struggle between making it look right and making it feel true.
Yes.
And so on Dirty Jobs, the only, I think, really smart thing I did on that show was I brought in a documentary camera, just a behind-the-scenes camera, and said to that camera, look, you never stop rolling, right? Your job is to always roll.
Yeah.
So if a take gets busted because a plane flies over or a battery runs out, I can always turn to that camera and tell the viewer at home what's going on in the course of our day. That changed everything for me, because that level of disclosure was weird, and seeing the crew on camera was weird.
Well, I was about to ask you, that was one of the things I always loved about that show. They were part of it. A lot of you got very famous doing that show, and a lot of famous people kind of send the crew out, and then, and I've done this, then you voice it later or whatever. You went on it, I mean, you were part of it, so you had to physically be there, and you always seemed like you were pretty close to the crew. Is that real?
Super close.
I love that.
Look, those guys went in first. I mean, 9 out of 10 times. Not all the time, but like if you see me crawling into the tube of a buoy that the Coast Guard pulls out, you know, if you see me crawling up that thing, it's because there's a cameraman up there. Now, sometimes I'd shoot it myself because two of us can't fit. So we were one of the first shows to take a little camera in my hand and shoot that. I did that in the opal mines. I did it in the coal mines. Did in a lot of places where cameramen couldn't go. But look, those guys, they risked their lives. They were in some of the highest places people have shot in, and the lowest places.
And you were on the road with them for years.
8 years. Yeah.
That's crazy.
What's crazy was not just the work. You know, I mean, it really, not to overstate it, but there is a we few, we happy few, we band of brothers mentality.
I believe it.
Certainly among Dirty Jobbers as a group, but also among my crew, because we realized early on that we were doing something that was unusual, and it was dangerous. And you know, we had each other's backs. You know, we all wanted to go home in one piece, but we were also staying in, you know, Super 8s and Motel 6s.
There's no choice.
Doesn't
matter how famous you are.
That's right. We stayed in all the hotels we stayed in had a number. Right? And it's interesting. If you see a hotel with a number, that you know, heads up. Now, if the number is written out like 4 seasons, FOUR,
you're in better shape.
But if it's 4 seasons. Anyway, so we're living in hotels with numbers. We're crawling through sewers, and at night I'm going on to, this is before Facebook, I'm going into the Dirty Jobs chat room to talk to viewers who are, at this point, programming the show. All the way back to the beginning. Mike, you should see my brother, my cousin, my uncle. Wait till you see what they do.
I believe it.
All the ideas for that show came from the viewers. And so the reason it worked wasn't because it was great. It worked because it was honest.
Yes.
And it worked.
And funny, too.
It was funny, but it wasn't a comedy.
Right.
But if anybody who's ever spent real time on a work site knows there is potential for great humor. Sometimes it's a gallows sense of humor. Sometimes it's just guys busting each other, but it's to take humor out of work and to portray work as a humorless endeavor.
Yes.
That's one of the great sins, I believe.
Well, sure. And also, I mean, anyone who's ever worked on a construction site or been around anybody in the trades, some cops.
Sure.
Hilarious.
Oh, my God.
Yes.
First responders, cops, plumbers are funny.
Yep.
Welders, not as hilarious, but always looking for the joke. You know what I mean? They recognize each other.
When I think welder, I think rich. Those guys make a lot. I don't know why. Why is everyone not a welder? Because it's complicated, I guess. That was part 1 of our conversation with Mike Rowe. Part 2, we'll pick up where we left off. That's the next episode.